Funerals are like family reunions, but with one less person to argue with, Annie mumbles under her breath. A haunting silence echoes through the cemetery as the movie opens. The daughter of the deceased, Annie, is uncomfortably giving a eulogy about her mother. As it's obvious, she doesn't know a lot about her mother, designating her as a private person. While the body of Annie's mother, Ellen, lay peacefully in the coffin, the family looks weary, but surprisingly, not sad, except for Annie's daughter, Charlie. During the eulogy, Charlie is seen with her drawing book, quietly drawing and making these weird tics with her tongue. After the eulogy, Charlie stares afar as some unknown people smile at her dead grandmother. Silently, she eats her chocolate, which concerns her parents, as it might contain peanuts that might trigger her allergic reaction. Back at home, Annie gets back to her work as if nothing's out of the ordinary. She's working on her miniature diorama for her upcoming exhibition. The piece is inspired by her home. Later that night, Annie comforts Charlie about her grandmother's demise. She tells the little girl that she had always been her grandma's favorite, but Charlie sadly mumbles that Ellen always wished for the kid to be a boy. She's also concerned that no one's going to take care of her now, after her grandma. Although Annie tries to reassure her that she will be the one to take care of her, Charlie stubbornly replies that there won't be anyone to look after her post Annie's death. This shakes Annie a little, but the poor mother continues to comfort the child. Before Annie retires to bed, she visits her work studio once more and goes through her mother's album. She abruptly closes it before the pictures can conjure the past. Suddenly, she spots the faint image of her mother smiling at her from the corner, making her freeze. Frightened, she hides her miniature diorama, depicting Ellen trying to breastfeed Charlie. At school, Charlie's busy playing with her toys instead of solving the quiz. The teacher persuades her to finish her task before playing. Just then, a bird forcefully hits the window. While the other kids are startled, Chris doesn't show any hint of reaction, but instead stares at a pair of scissors. During her break, she decapitates the dead bird and stuffs the head in her hoodie. At the same time, Annie notices the door to her mother's room is opened and a weird triangle is drawn on the floor. A sense of discomfort plummets through her and she quickly shuts the door. Upon asking her husband, he states that he hadn't been to the room. To comfort his wife, Steve locks it. Just then, he gets a call from the cemetery informing him that Ellen's grave has been desecrated. He decides to not let his wife know, given her present condition. Concurrently, Annie lies to Steve about going to the cinema and visits a grief support group instead. At the session, Annie opens up about her life, and evidently, it's a lot. She talks about the death of her mother, revealing that she had been suffering from dementia and dissociative identity disorder. She also discloses her troubled relationship with her mother, emphasizing her insistence on keeping the old woman away from her firstborn, Peter. She also reveals that her father had starved himself to death while her brother had been suffering from schizophrenia, who had also sadly taken his life at the mere age of 16. Her facade of detachment fades away and she wallows in her feeling of guilt. The next morning, we find Charlie in her room. She finds a halo-like cryptic light pass by and follows it while carrying the head of the bird. Suddenly, she sees her grandmother surrounded by flames in the distance. Inside the house, Peter asks Annie permission to go to a barbecue party. He lies about the drinking, and that's going to cost him eventually. Anyway, Annie forces Peter to take his little sister with him. It might serve as a medium to uplift her mood amongst the events of the past week. Charlie initially resists, but gives in nonetheless. Peter isn't too happy to take his sister to a high school party either. At the party, Peter acts like an irresponsible brother and leaves Charlie by herself. He goes to smoke a pot with his friends after urging her to eat the chocolate cake. On the very first bite, she feels a little discomfort. The feeling heightens and suddenly Charlie struggles to breathe. As it turns out, the cake had peanuts. She finds Peter, who freaks out and proceeds to immediately drive her to the hospital. On the way, Charlie struggles more and more. She almost looks like she's being strangled. To reduce the pain, she sticks her head outside the car window, while Peter repeatedly asks her to stop. As a result of the extreme speed of the car, the high that Peter's riding at, and the abrupt presence of a dead deer in the road, Peter fiercely swerves the car. And alas, Charlie's hand smacks against a pole with incredible speed, resulting in her immediate decapitation. Peter stops his car, breathing heavily. He's shaken and disoriented. Instead of checking anything, he goes back and lays down on his bed while his sister's severed head lies on the pavement, infested with ants. In the morning, he hears his mother leave for work. After a moment, he hears an agonizing scream when Annie finds the headless body of her beloved daughter. Her screams of pain echo as we witness the last service of Charlie. The following day, Peter has a panic attack in school whilst smoking weed. When his friends try to calm him down, he replies that his throat is getting bigger. reminiscent of what Charlie told him on the night she had passed away. His guilt and repentance drown him. Annie, on the other hand, goes to the support group again but changes plans midway. She is stopped by a kind woman named Joan who tries to be soothing. Joan's grandson and son had drowned to death 4 months ago. Thus, both mothers find solidarity in the losses. Joan shares her number with Annie and advises her to contact her if she ever needs someone to talk to. Back home, the family slowly starts to crumble away. Annie spends her night at the treehouse that Charlie loves, and Peter gets scared at night at the sight of his hoodie, mistaking it to be his sister. The next day, Annie goes to visit Joan. At the doorway, she notices a handmade mat that looked similar to the ones her mother used to make. She mentions it to Joan, who seems to be delighted at the coincidence. Further, Annie opens up about Charlie and recounts a horrifying incident regarding her sleepwalking tendencies. One time, she had woken up to find herself and her children doused with paint thinner. To add to the horror, she held a lighted match. Peter had woken up to this, screaming in fear, which had resulted in a strained relationship between them. Back at her place, Annie seems to be slowly losing her mind to the grief. She proceeds to make a miniature replication of the accident, stating that it's an objective view of the incident. This rightfully pisses Steve off. At dinner, there's tension between Peter and Annie yet again. Although Steve tries to intervene to stop it from blowing out, he fails. When Peter asks his mother to just be out with whatever she wants to say, Annie loses her calm. She blames Peter for Charlie's death, dejectedly claiming that although it had been an accident, he should have at least taken responsibility. She laments the situation of the family, which forces Peter to question her decision to send Charlie to the party in the first place. Before the argument could get any worse, Stephen forcibly asks them to quit it. Annie walks out. The next morning, Annie tries desperately to get back to her work. After a trip to the art supply store, she finds Joan in the parking lot. Upon seeing her joyous demeanor, she displays curiosity. Joan replies that she had attended an open seance, where she had learned how to conduct one herself. During the procedure, she contacted her grandson. Annie, of course, doesn't believe it and laughs at the absurdity. This makes Joan beg her to come to witness the disturbing phenomenon herself. At Joan's apartment, she prepares for the seance. She lights a candle, and the two women place their hands on a glass. Joan calls out to her grandson and asks him to move the glass if he is indeed present in the room. And lo and behold, the glass moves, terrifying the wits out of Annie. The seance continues, breaking Annie more and more. When she asks to leave, Joan slips her a paper, instructing her to read it if she wanted to initiate the procedure herself. She also advises bringing her entire family together to perform the seance. On the way, Annie hears Charlie's tick, driving her to another breakdown. That night, she wakes up to a swarm of ants leading to Peter's body. Suddenly, Peter wakes up in fear and claims that she's sleepwalking. Annie, on the other hand, abruptly reveals that she didn't want to be his mother and tried to have a miscarriage. As Peter cries, she finds themselves lit up. Annie wakes up all of the sudden. She goes to Peter's room and shakes him awake, apologizing for the previous night. She forces Steve to wake up too to perform the seance. Both seem reluctant to indulge in the absurd operation, but give in at the end. Upon asking Charlie to indicate her presence, the glass moves by itself. Suddenly, the candle flares up and a glass falls behind. This compels Steve to ask Annie to drop the entire thing, but she grows more and more hysterical. This doesn't stop here. As a moment of silence later, it seems like Charlie has possessed Annie. Peter begins to shout in terror, while Steve throws a glass of water at Annie to break her from the trance. Annie seems confused about the incident that has transpired, while Peter continues sobbing. At school, Peter sees the same halo-like light that Charlie had seen in her room. He stares in horror when he sees his reflection smirking at him. He scrambles to his feet and leaves. Steve calls Annie to inform her about the hysteric phone call he had gotten from Peter. He seems to blame Annie for everything. Annie is further distressed when she gets a call from work. The pressure gets to her, and she vehemently destroys the miniature diorama in her studio. She also finds Charlie's notebook filled with drawings of Peter's manner of death. Peter is not doing any better. At night, he sees Charlie in the corner of his room. Her head falls off her body, revealing that it has just been a ball. Despite this, he feels something is wrong as their dog begins to bark at him. Suddenly, he's grabbed by the head, making him thrash around in suffocation. When Annie walks in, Peter accuses him of sleepwalking and attacking him. She forcibly makes him listen to her, claiming that there's something strange in the house and only she can stop it. Annie takes the drawing book and throws it at their fireplace, but her arm soon catches fire. Realizing that she's linked to the horror, she doesn't let the book get destroyed. Feeling helpless, she goes to Joan for assistance, but her apartment is locked and she's nowhere in sight. Unbeknownst to Annie, there are items for witchcraft in her house, including a picture of Peter and some of Charlie's crafts. Annie also sees the doormat again and quickly returns home. She rummages through her mother's belonging, discovering the similar mats her mother had made for them too. Further, she discovers that Joan and Ellen had been friends. Her curiosity gets deeper, making her dig more. This leads her to find a book about King Paimon, one of the 7 kings of hell. The book reveals the procedure to administer the soul of King Paimon into the body of a male host. At school, Peter spots Joan, who cryptically yells, "I expel you," at him. Confused, he only manages to look around. During class, Peter hears Charlie's tick. Suddenly, Peter raises his hand, alarmingly bending his body. He smacks his head straight on his desk, breaking his nose. This gets him out of his trance. Now, back at home, Annie opens the attic and climbs in. The place is swarming with flies, further containing a strange smell. She finds the blackened, headless corpse of her mother. On the wall, painted in blood, is the sigil of King Paimon. Meanwhile, Steve drives his son back and agonizingly breaks down at the despair. When they reach home, Annie cries at the state of her son. She tries to explain to Steve about the entire situation, blaming herself for putting her son in danger. She makes him see the corpse, which in turn gives the wrong idea to Steve. Annie must have been the one to desecrate Ellen's grave. Annie tries to explain to him that if he burns the drawing book, Peter will be saved, but Steve just claims that she's sick. Having had enough, Annie grabs the book from him and throws it in the fireplace. Steve immediately lights up in flames as Annie watches in horror until she doesn't. Her expression swiftly changes to satisfaction at the sight of her barbecued husband. Night befalls, and Peter wakes up to complete darkness. He finds the lights of the treehouse to be turned on. Unfortunately, he doesn't notice his mother crawling away from behind him. Getting no answer from her parents when he calls for them, he begins to search, prompting him to witness the sight of his father burnt to a crisp. Unbeknownst to him, his mother is behind him, seemingly ready to pounce at him. Suddenly, at a distance, he sees an unknown man smiling. As if that isn't enough, his mother begins to chase after him. He quickly turns to the attic and closes the door behind him, repeatedly apologizing to his mother, who bangs her head continuously against the wall. In the attic, Peter comes across his photo in the middle of the triangle. He slaps himself to wake up from the nightmare, but stops when he witnesses the most horrifying nightmare of all. His mother is levitating while trying to decapitate herself. Horrified, he jumps out of the window. Somewhere, Annie's head falls. The strange light finally enters Peter's body. Peter, now harboring the soul of King Paimon, wakes up and walks towards the treehouse. Unknown people are surrounding their house, all smiling at him. Up in the treehouse, several people are bowing down, showing respect for the newfound king. In a bizarre turn of events, there's a statue with Charlie's head adorned in a crown. In front, the decapitated bodies of Annie and Ellen are also in a posture showing respect. Joan appears suddenly and calls him Charlie, stating that he has finally found the male host. She also transfers the crown to the new king. He's now King Paimon. The followers begin to pay respect to the new king.